One of the things that I've attempted to do because of the skepticism, and not only skepticism, but in some cases, outright rejection. This is not worth my time, Cameron. I got bottom line results to be accountable for, and you're telling me just saying happy tunes and think happy thoughts. Happyology is not relevant. So, what we've done is essentially try to answer the question, does this actually matter in terms of bottom line results? Do positive practices account for outcomes that people care about? And the answer is unequivocally yes. So far, no disconfirming evidence. That is, when organizations implement positive practices of a variety of kind, we can talk about what those are, but it's not unusual. It's getting serious about virtuousness and positive leadership practices and so on. Bottom line results change markedly.
Welcome to E3, Engage and Empower with Empathy, a podcast brought to you by the Empathy Collective, a consulting firm that helps business leaders inspire change, one conversation at a time. I'm Rebecca Drema, your host and founder of the Empathy Collective, and we are building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. Whether you are a plant manager trying to humanize the factory floor, a small business owner wanting to build a strong culture that lasts, or a corporate executive striving to prevent burnout in your team, you belong in this community. Most leaders want their organizations to do well, but what if they could do more than that? What if they could achieve the kind of extraordinary outcomes that uplift not only the bottom line, but also the human spirit? My guest today, Dr. Kim Cameron, has dedicated his career to showing us that it's possible. As Professor Emeritus of Management and Organizations and co-founder of the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, he is a pioneer in the field of positive organizational scholarship. He reveals how organizations that practice what he calls positive deviance go beyond the norm in life-giving, affirming ways, consistently outperform expectations. His work is deeply connected to that of his colleague, Bob Quinn, whose books, The Positive Organization and Deep Change, remind us that transformation happens when people and leaders are willing to embrace vulnerability, empathy, and courage in the face of uncertainty. This is E3, Engage and Empower with Empathy. Welcome to the show, Kim. It's so nice to see your smiling face this morning. I've been looking forward to this conversation for months now because I actually read your book, Practicing Positive Leadership, over the summer. It was one of my vacation reads. And
You're
in fact,
amazing.
I remember we went to the beach with my family, and I remember going for runs in the morning, and I was listening to your book while I was running and looking at the ocean. So you can imagine, as I was taking in positive
My
leadership, I
goodness.
was looking at the ocean while running.
Well, I admire you a lot for running, for reading, for remembering anything that's in that book. My goodness, you're amazing. You're a wonderful example.
I know you've published many books, and if I listed them all out, it would probably take 10 minutes because you've done extensive research in the field of positive leadership together with your colleagues Bob Quinn and Jane Dutton. I had the pleasure of hosting Bob on my show. I love to hear your journey into this area of research, because I know it started very early on in your career when you were a young man in college.
Well, it's been an interesting trip. I would never have predicted when I was in graduate school that I would end up writing about and doing research on what we're talking about today. I'll tell you a little bit of the story. My first job out of graduate school was the University of Wisconsin. I spent 3 years there. Then my next job was running a research center in Boulder, Colorado, funded by the federal government. The charge was to study how to manage colleges and universities, which is an impossible job to do, and they're organized anarchies and so on. But at that time in the history of our country, the baby boomer demographic had been through the higher education system. Their children had been through the higher education system, and there was a marked diminishing or decline in the number of college-age students available. Fewer college-age students in the next 10 years than had been there before. If you distribute 400,000 students across the universities in the United States, the prediction was that about a third of colleges and universities would go out of business, simply lack of students. Turns out that didn't happen because college-age students, instead of 18 to 24, became 18 to 34. And so we simply filled colleges with different students. But we were doing research because colleges were worried. We were doing research on how do you manage retrenchment, decline? That is, how do you reduce? Turns out the research is very clear, not only what we were doing, but many others. Downsizing is almost always a negative influence on organizations. Almost all organizations deteriorate in performance for a lot of reasons. I mean, trust is damaged, relationships are damaged, communication channels are damaged, threat rigidity response occurs. People get threatened, they get rigid, innovation goes down, and so on, a whole bunch of things. Well, about 90% of organizations that downsized deteriorated in performance. That's also typical of business. However, that leaves 10 or 15% that flourished after downsizing. And the question became, well, how do you explain that relatively few group that really flourished and everybody else who did not? Well, I didn't have empirical data, but the impression was very strong and very clear. Those organizations that got better were characterized by virtuous, positive, not only performance, but activities and leadership and processes and so on. That is forgiveness and compassion and empathy and gratitude were all just embedded in the organization's culture. Leaders were different in those organizations. Even though they're facing these crises, they responded in a very different way than almost anybody else did. Back then, it was completely illegitimate to study something like virtuousness or even positive. Soupy, syrupy, saccharine sweet, just sing a happy tune, everything's going to be fine. Well, it's not fine, for heaven's sake. I gave a talk in a Academy of Management meeting, and somebody called me up about 6 months later, and they said, I listened to your talk, and one of the things you mentioned was that organizations that get better also have embedded a culture of forgiveness, turning negatives into learning opportunities. And I didn't know if you knew, but the Templeton Foundation is sponsoring a whole bunch of research on, at least they're funding research on forgiveness. You might be interested. Well, I never did believe forgiveness was the single most important factor, but it was one of them. It was embedded with a whole bunch of other practices. So I applied for a research grant. They funded me. Trouble is, I was on my way to become a dean in a business school. And the trouble is, I couldn't do research, for heaven's sake. People are working, at least I was working 18-hour days. No way in the world I was going to do research. I hoped to get a doctoral student to kind of help, but nobody would touch it. It was just not legitimate back then. Well, 6 years later, I returned to Michigan, called up Templeton and said, I haven't done the research, but I want to. And I'm now back on the faculty and can. Their response was, look, you're the only non-psychologist we've funded. We really want to understand how this works in organizations. How do organizations forgive or have a culture of forgiveness compared to just a single change of heart, change of mind in an individual? So I came back to Michigan. People said, okay, you've been gone for 6 years. What are you doing now? And I started explaining this approach. People's eyes would glass over. They'd say, holy cow, Cameron, what in the world happened to you? Have you gone crazy? This administrative role really changed you. But my friend Jane Dutton, whom you'll talk to, and my friend Bob Quinn, whom you have talked to, were at Michigan and they were good friends. But Jane had created a compassion lab. And what that was is a set of doctoral students and her studying compassion in organizations. One of the triggers for that was an apartment building in Ann Arbor burned to the ground. 3 Michigan business school students were living there, lost everything. They were foreign students, lost computers, lost notes, lost clothes 2 weeks before final exams. Well, somebody was driving on the way to work who happened to be an employee of the business school, noticed these young students standing literally in the front lawn of this burned out building, recognized that one of them was a business school student. So she made a phone call, called financial aid, called housing, called a variety of other people. And nobody organized this from the top. It was not one of those things where somebody gets on the microphone and says, okay, we're going to organize. But as a result of that, the executive resident said, we'll put them up free of charge and feed them meals through finals. The students organized probably 50 or 60 people, copied their class notes, gave them to these students so they could study for exams. The technology people got them laptop computers so they could continue on with their work. It became one of those wonderful descriptions of a organization that had embedded in its culture this idea of compassion, assistance, and so on. Nobody told them they had to; they just did it. So Jane began studying that phenomenon in organizations, and she's done wonderful work. Bob, my good friend, whom I'd known since I was about 20 years old, was studying deep change and how you help organizations become value-centered and so on. So the three of us got together, and there was certain commonality among what we were doing. And we said, we ought to learn from each other. The trouble is, the default option for scholars is to go in your office, close the door, and do your work individually. So we said, let's overcome that momentum. So we created a center called the Center for Positive Organizations, just trying to make available and have it be legitimate to study things that were generally philosophical, religious, spiritual, not mainline. Turns out now we have several hundred positive scholars around the world who've said, this is interesting to us. And sure enough, there have been wonderful findings that have emerged in my own work. Essentially, positive practices, virtuous activities, positive culture is far more predictive of success than normal organizations. In fact, the amount of variance accounted for exceeds the other things that we normally study, like incentive systems and processes and strategy and so on.
It's a wonderful journey. I know it takes a lot to explain how you got to where you are because it's such an interesting path where you eventually ended up building this center with your colleagues, Jane and Bob. And I love how practical this book is that you published, the Practicing Positive Leadership. You were saying initially when you presented this topic, people's eyes glazed over. And honestly, even in today's modern workplaces, with the consulting work that I do, which focuses on the human side of change, if you approach certain leaders, you still get that same reaction. It's like, okay, well, this is all nice, but how's this going to affect my bottom line?
True.
So we'll get to that in a second, but I'd love to talk a little bit about what you describe as positive deviance. So you talked about the overarching concept of positive leadership in an organization, but you describe positive deviance as going beyond the norm to achieve extraordinary results. And I'd love for you to share an example because I actually believe I have an example of my own in my career where this took place. And if you probably researched her, you'd probably discover that she was being positively deviant. But my former manager, who is now my co-founder, she had this incredible gift of being able to build resilience in a team, even when there was chaos, like
Mm.
chaos happening around her. And when we walked away from corporate, we wanted to examine what is it about teams that who are resilient. And you mentioned this after downsizing, there's a small percentage of organizations who actually move in a positive direction after a downsizing because they have these virtuous tendencies. So we were looking at it kind of at the team level and we were calling it collective empathy. And I know
Mm.
Bob Quinn has talked about collective empathy on his blog too. What is that secret? Like, do you have examples in your career of leaders you've studied who have been what you would call positively deviant? And how has that resulted in better performance for their team
Yes.
or for the organization?
I have to preface it by saying there's an old saying, if you can't do it, you teach it. So I teach it, you do it. I admire you a lot. Now, more seriously, one of the things that I've attempted to do because of the skepticism, and not only skepticism, but in some cases, outright rejection. This is not worth my time, Cameron. I got bottom line results to be accountable for, and you're telling me just sing happy tunes and think happy thoughts. Happyology is not relevant. So, what we've done is essentially try to answer the question, does this actually matter in terms of bottom line results? Things for which people are held accountable are of positive practices. Do positive practices account for outcomes that people care about? And the answer is unequivocally yes. So far, no disconfirming evidence. That is, when organizations implement positive practices of a variety of kind, we can talk about what those are, but it's not unusual. It's getting serious about virtuousness and positive leadership practices and so on. Bottom line results change markedly. In terms of positive deviance, I like to think about positive deviance on a continuum because the word deviance in English normally means something negative. I'll spend some time with individuals in charge of corrections systems in the United States, prisons. When I think of deviance, they talk about we got to lock those people up. So you can think of a continuum. On the left-hand side is negative deviance, what we normally think of as aberrations on the negative side. In the middle of that continuum, we'd say that's an absence of deviance. On the right-hand side, we call that positive deviance. Now, there's several implications of thinking about deviance on a continuum. One of them is that almost all organizations aspire to be right in the middle of that continuum, that is, absent problematic performance. What's interesting, and that is, organization by definition means things that are organized, not aberrations and unpredictable activities. Well, it turns out, if you think about the left-hand side of that continuum, just as an illustration, in medicine, that would represent illness. I got heart disease, I got diabetes, I got the flu, I got COVID. I'm not doing well. 90% of all medical research focuses on the gap between the left-hand side and the middle of the continuum. Once I'm in the middle, absent illness, absent deviance, physical deviance, then for the most part, healthcare doesn't worry about me much. I mean, I get a physical exam once a year, but I do it only because they're trying to keep me away from the left-hand side of that continuum. Psychologically, it's worse. 90% or so of psychological research focuses on the gap between the left-hand side and the middle. Left-hand side would be anxiety, schizophrenia, STD, suicidal thoughts, and so on. Once I'm in the middle, I'm happy. Things are just fine. That's where we stop. On the right-hand side is positively deviant. Health, for example. I mean, the ability to do 400 push-ups or run a Ironman competition, or 5% body fat for men, 15% body fat for women. I mean, there's a little research on that, not much, but there is extraordinary, spectacular examples of health. Psychologically, some years ago, we had a colleague named Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, wrote a book called Flow. And that simply describes a condition where you're so immersed in a task you care about, you lose track of time, you lose track of physiological needs. If you put electrodes on your brain, you're using more of your brain capacity than normal. It's an extraordinary mental state. Well, little research on that, not much, but that's positively deviant psychological state. Organizations are the same. For the most part, organizations, if they're not making money, if they're losing market share, if customers are not satisfied, if they're losing clients, that is the negative side, spend much of their time trying to eliminate that gap between the left-hand side and the middle, which is we're now making money, we're fine, market share is fine, customers are satisfied, everything's great. That's essentially where we stop. On the right-hand side, there's spectacular, extraordinary, better than anybody assumed was possible. That is positively deviant, spectacular performance. So we've done research on organizations that exceed industry averages by 5. We wrote a book on a nuclear arsenal where they made triggers that went into nuclear weapons that the U.S. made during a Cold War. George Herbert Walker Bush said, we're not going to make nuclear weapons anymore, so we're going to close this facility, which is called the Rocky Flats Nuclear Arsenal. The estimated time to clean up and close Rocky Flats, because there's 21 tons of plutonium, for example, nuclear grade material. Half-life of plutonium is 26,000 years. So once you have it, it's not going anywhere. The most dangerous place on the American continent. It was awful. And nobody knew how polluted it was. There was lots and lots of problems. They published 70 years to finish the job. The actual number was 200 years. But they said we can't send out an RFP, request for proposal, for 200 years. Nobody's going to bid on that. So they published 70. It was going to cost, the estimate, $36 billion. But the assumption was that's probably going to be $200 billion. But again, nobody's going to bid on that. They finished the job in 10 years at the cost of $6 billion. $6 billion. It's cleaner now than it was in 51 when they first created this. I mean, a dramatic, so much beyond expectation that people say, no, it can't be true. There's got to be some other explanation. But as it turns out, positive leadership trumped. And the activities, the reward system, I mean, all kinds of strategic moves they made prioritize the positive end of that continuum rather than the negative. And you don't have to solve problems, of course. But it was a dramatic, inspiring kind of example. There's such a lot of evidence now that these kinds of practices matter a lot in terms of what people are held accountable for.
And that's an incredibly inspiring example, and I'm sure very exceptional in many ways. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the small baby steps or behaviors that leaders can take to move in that direction towards positive deviance. And one of the things that I'd like to focus on that you mentioned in the book is around giving negative feedback in a positive way. Because that is one thing that I encounter working with leaders from, mid-level leaders all the way up to the senior executive level. That's always a pain point for people. And we have to spend time coaching leaders on how to give feedback in a way that's constructive, that doesn't make the recipient feel bad, because feedback should be a gift, right? But it feels like most leaders feel like they have to walk on eggshells there. Based on the research you've done, what would your advice be?
Good question. One of the problems with the negative feedback is almost always, not only does it make people feel bad, but it creates some kind of a negative label. We call it evaluative communication. If I say to you, you're wrong, that's an evaluation that is a sort of a downer. It sucks the life right out of you, all of us. So there's an alternative to that. And lots of people know a lot about this, more than I do, but here's what's worked for me. And here's what the research that I've done suggests. So instead of evaluative feedback, I'm going to give you an evaluation. You're not doing so well. You change that to what's called descriptive feedback. Descriptive feedback has 3 steps. Number 1, describe as objectively as possible what you just observed. I noticed that you didn't hit the numbers this week, or you were supposed to do 10 widgets and you did 8. Just a description. No evaluation of you. It's just, here's what I noticed. Step 2, here's the consequence, or here's my reaction. Makes me feel bad, makes me disappointed, or, it's bringing down the averages for which our customers are expecting us, or whatever, something. I'm making these examples up and they're not very good. So here's what happened. Here's my reaction. Here's what happened. Here's the consequence. Step 3, here's a suggested alternative that would be more acceptable. So never do I say, you're an idiot, you're doing things wrong. I simply say, here's what I observed, here's what I noticed, here's a suggestion that would be more acceptable. So now if there's disagreement, now we discuss the alternative, how to get better, rather than the value or evaluation of the person. It just tries to avoid this notion of sucking the life right out of me, having a negative influence. I'm going to try as best I can to have you feel capable, competent, and able to continue to improve. Now, I'm very conscious, Rebecca, that you're an expert. You could do a good evaluation of my description.
Well, it is a constant learning journey for me, and I will tell you as a parent, it's even harder. With children, I feel like it's almost easier to help leaders give feedback than it is with my own children. So, yeah, we're all learning together and doing our best. So let's talk a little bit about change. Now you talked about deep change and the work that Bob Quinn was doing, and you were working together from a very young age, and so you're very intimately involved in this topic. And I feel like change is happening at such a rapid pace now that most of the leaders I speak to, they laugh when I mention change management because they're like, change management. We don't even have time to manage change. It just hits us in the face and we have to react to it. In your experience working together with Bob on this topic, how does empathy help leaders move through this constant fluctuation, this discomfort that we all seem to be sitting in right now? So that we can still inject that positivity into the organization, especially in this environment where many organizations are downsizing.
Yeah.
And I mean, you said it yourself, most organizations really suffer after downsizing. And I think about people who are left behind. They feel guilty because they weren't let go. So there are so many elements to that. How do we help organizations get back into that positive trajectory after downsizing, on top of all the changes that are happening around us?
That's true. We're in a broad environment that I don't like at all. Too much cynicism, too much skepticism, too much disagreement, too much hostility, too much criticism of one another, personalization, and a whole bunch of things that are just not good, don't feel good, and don't create kind of outcomes we want. However, there are lots of examples where the reverse occurs. For me, empathy, among other things, simply means the extent to which I can understand, feel what you feel, adopt a perspective that you carry, and so on. So, one of the things that I've noticed some organizations doing is adding to their reward system another approach. And it has to do with prioritizing contribution more than reward. Here's what I mean by that. I have a colleague in the psychology department at Michigan who did this study. She took entering freshmen at Michigan, asked them to identify their goals for the year. Now, everybody has lots of goals, but she categorized the goals into two types. One type was called achievement goals. I want to get good grades. I want to be popular. I want a girlfriend, whatever. The other kind of goal was called contribution goals. I want to make a difference. I want to have something get better because what I've done. She put people in two groups depending on which type of goal was dominant. The study was she simply followed these students for one academic year, measuring things like how well they got along with their roommates, how many times they got elected to a club office, I mean, popularity issues, social factors. Physical factors, how many times they got the flu, missed class, got injured, minor physiological issues. Cognitive, academic activities, what their grade point average was, what their test scores were at the end of each semester. On every single dimension, contribution goals were more predictive of success than were achievement goals. I mean, something you'd not expect. There are several other studies. Just one other is, for example, multiple sclerosis patients. Half of these people were assigned to receive a phone call once a week from somebody expressing love, support, and concern. The other half of these people were assigned to place a phone call to somebody else expressing love, support, concern to them. 2 years later, they measured self-efficacy, physical activity, hope, depression, and so on. Eightfold difference. Those people who placed the phone call were 8 times healthier than those people who received the phone call. Contribution is the predictor. A lot of organizations I know, they simply prioritize contributing to the value, to the welfare, to the benefit of somebody else. And it redounds to the benefit of the individual and to the organization. For example, we have a person in charge of faculty support at the business school. She learned about this instituted an interesting award system. So when somebody did something especially recognizable or should have a reward, she gave them an award, and it's a certificate or a coin or a stuffed animal or something. Then she gave them a second one and assigned them to give the second one to somebody else. Anytime, in other words, anytime anybody did something special, they got a chance to give an award. I was talking to somebody literally this last week who said, "Oh yeah, we've instituted something like that. We ask all of the employees to kind of look for and be sensitive to people who go beyond the expectation, of above and beyond. We give them an award, and it's a $50 gift certificate. But then we also give them another $30 gift certificate, which they have to give to somebody else. And that person has to use that gift certificate to give to somebody else still." And she said, "You can't believe the stories that we get that are just inspiring." That is, contribution ends up being the way the organization sort of light the fire. You'd not expect it, but it is. I've learned something I have a daughter who's a mother of 3 little children. She's an attorney. Her youngest is, one of those active children has his own mind, and his name is Valor. And she'll say, "Valor, you need to clean up that mess." There's not a chance in the world he's gonna clean up that mess,
Sounds
or
like
even take your
a
dishes to the
conversation.
sink. Take your dishes to the sink, so she's changed. And instead of that, she says, "Valor, would you do me a favor? Would you take your dishes over there and put them in the sink?" Every time. "Just, would you help me, please?"
Mm.
People will do that. All human beings are inclined to be helpful, to assist somebody else. I mean, moms are the quintessential example of that. So organizations, as it turns out, when they begin prioritizing contribution, and many do, empathy and uh, I'm about ready to say the feeling of love and attraction just elevates. It's energizing. What's in my mind is another study. So in this study, they took children ages 3 months to 8 months. These children were simply put a child on a caregiver's lap, have them watch a puppet show for maybe 20 seconds or 30 seconds. So a puppet tries to walk across the stage, tries to climb a hill, tries to open a box. Then you have 2 other puppets. One puppet tries to help, support, encourage. The other tries to hinder. Puts a block up, you can't make up the hill. Jumps on the box, you can't open the box. Then after 20 or 30 seconds, you bring these 2 puppets out, put it in front of the child, and the child can select whichever puppet he or she wants to play with. A large majority of the time, almost 90% of the time, the child selects the puppet that tries to help rather than tries to hinder. That is, from the time you are 3 months old, long before you learn language, long before you're socialized, there is an inherent tendency in all human beings toward the positive, toward positive energy, toward virtuousness, and so on. That is, it's inherent in human beings. Now, we drive it out for all kinds of reasons. I mean, the incentive systems in our environment don't necessarily support that. But if you can touch the fundamental basic human nature, then you do better. That's essentially the finding of all this research.
I remember the last time we talked, you had mentioned how all living organisms kind of lean towards the light, to positivity.
True.
And I feel like we tend to forget that companies or organizations are living organisms comprised of humans, and those humans all want to lean towards the positive or to the light. So I feel like organizations need to treat their collective community as a living organism that would naturally want to lean towards light. So that being said, what I see leaders really struggling with is when times are good, all of these reward systems around contribution, like the examples you provided, they're great. Companies embrace it. They're like, yeah, this is a great idea, great initiative. And then all of a sudden, pressure's on. numbers are down, downsizing is happening, people get stressed out, and they forget about those really important behaviors and gestures that help bring that organization towards the light, towards the positivity, to sustain that and really become a healthy organization. I mean, I love that you gave examples of the students and how the psychology professor measured injuries and illnesses as well. I mean, that really impacts the psyche of people, and we're seeing so much burnout in organizations right now. We're seeing high levels of anxiety in society as a whole. So obviously, we spend most of
Yeah.
our lives at work, so work is affecting a huge part of that. And I just interviewed Raj Sisodia, who partnered with Bob Chapman and wrote Everybody Matters. And he was saying that the highest rate of heart attacks happen at 4 a.m. on Monday morning. And it's because we're about to go back to work. And then we have this phrase, TGIF, thank God it's Friday. Why? Because we're just, counting down the days until the weekend happens. It shouldn't be this way. To come back to my original question, I'm just wondering how we can get beyond the short-term mindset of, okay, we have to make sure our quarterly earnings statement looks good. How are the numbers looking? To looking at the long-term health of the organization and sustaining a culture that really creates this positive environment that also fuels productivity.
This question reminds me of one that you asked a little bit earlier, having to do with change. I'm going to describe one of the things that has worked remarkably well for me. It's called a 90 in 90 challenge. So I'm going to give you a real example. We have an organization. It was the largest university consortium in the world. They own universities throughout the world. Central and South America, Australia, New Zealand, Middle East, Europe, and so on. 69 universities. They polled the presidents and chancellors of these organizations together, and we had a chance to take a couple of those days and talk about positive leadership, positive practices, and so on with them. Then we asked them, as part of that assignment, to identify the positive energizers in their institutions or their region of the world. There were 12 regions in the world. The reason I mention that is this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. Sometimes people say, oh, well, it's fine to America, but look, it doesn't happen in Nigeria or something. They identified 46 people who they said these are positive energizers. Now, what does that mean? That means when they walk in the room, it just lights up the room. They're people who always have a smile on their face, or at least a positive demeanor. They never suck the life right out of you. Now, I'm going to take a side trip. There are several kinds of energy. One's physical energy, which when you use it, it diminishes. So sometimes people say, well, energizers just mean the personality attribute of extroversion versus introversion, extrovert versus introverts. And sometimes extroverts just drive you crazy because they're first to jump in, they dominate, they don't pay attention, and so on. So it's not that. In fact, we've done research correlating positive energy and extroversion, introversion, and the correlation is essentially zero. That is, introverts and extroverts have equal opportunity to be positive energizers. It's not personality. So physical energy is one. Emotional energy. I go to a ball game and scream and holler, or I get an intense interaction. It's diminishing. My energy wanes. I got to have recuperation time. Mental energy is the same. We have semester breaks. We have weekends because, I take an exam and holy cow, I'm exhausted. The only kind of energy that elevates with use is relational energy. The kind of energy that is exchanged between two people. And it has to do with a lot of attributes that we could talk about. We all sort of know that, but there are some people who just lift me. So when I get exhausted in other ways, I seek out people who help lift me. That is, the relational energy is a renewing factor. It helps perpetuate more. They learned, this group of people, I'm talking about presidents and chancellors of universities, said, okay, we can identify positive energizers. 46 people. We brought them together for 2 days and simply gave them the data. Here's some studies. Here's some examples of practices. Here's some assessment instruments you can use if you want to. We didn't give them a prescription. We didn't give them a checkbox list. We just said, here's how you can do this. We're going to give you an assignment. The assignment is your job is to infect the rest of your organizations with positive leadership, positive culture, positive practices, and you have to do it in 90 days. You have to infect 90% in 90 days. That's the 90 and 90 challenge. The first question is, okay, what does infect mean? Infect means that somebody's been infected if they can explain or describe or teach what it means to be a positive, energizing place, organization, positive, energizing person. And they've attempted a 1% improvement themselves. 1% is good. Anybody can pick 1%. The reason that's important is you get in an airplane in, I don't know, Washington, D.C., go around the world, you're off 1 degree, you end up south of Atlanta, north of Bangor, Maine. Doesn't take much change to put you in a very different place. So pick 1%. 1% times, actually, the number of people involved was 135,000 people across that organization. That's a big change.
Yeah.
Well, we turned them loose. They had to report every week. They didn't have to, but they did report every week to a clearinghouse about things they were doing. A whole bunch of 1%ers on their own. I mean, they did enormously inspiring activities just on their own, these positive energizers, and got a bunch of other positive energizers to help them. Well, 90 days later, 96% of 135,000 people had been infected by positive practices, positive energizing. And as you might expect, the scores on all these assessment instruments, I mean, student satisfaction and so on and so on and so on, all went up markedly. That's happened during COVID. I mean, we have a unit in the University of Michigan administration, the business and finance group, who decided to embark on this. And about 60 days in, COVID hit and things shut down. Business and finance has bus drivers and pipe fitters all the way up through people managing billion-dollar endowments, So essentially white collar to blue collar.
Yeah.
The big shots with ties on, white shirts and ties on, could stay home during COVID. The bus drivers couldn't stay home. So quite a big difference. Despite that, that's the only unit in the university where all the scores went up after this 90 and 90 challenge. So just another example of, you know what, it actually works when you allow people to do what they know how to do without very many directions, other than a goal.
And that's the beauty of that. You didn't give them much direction. You just said, go infect people. And then they tuned into their natural instincts.
Yeah.
And look at the magic that happened.
That's true.
And I love that example of that being implemented right before COVID, and then COVID hit. So you have data points pre-COVID and during COVID, and how it still elevated people during what was a crisis situation.
That's
for
true.
So many people. So yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great example to end the conversation today. And I think given the environment we're in right now, we're not in a pandemic, but to your point, there's a lot of negativity circulating around in society, not just in the United States, but also globally. And I think the conversation today lifted me up, and I hope that leaders out there can find some sort of reassurance that it's just small, basic things like leaning into our human instincts towards leaning to the light, leaning towards positivity can make a huge impact on our companies and on our society. So thank you for sharing all of your wisdom.
Thank you.
Today.
Thanks for being such a good example.
Well, thank you. I hope that I'm infecting people. That's I'm going to really deliberately think about that as I go about my day today now. So thank you for helping me think differently.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's great to spend time with you, Rebecca. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you would like to learn more about the Empathy Collective, check out our website, theempathycollective.com. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.